It was a normal morning at the airport. People rushed from gate to gate, dragging their bags, looking at their phones. Some were excited, some were tired, some just wanted to reach their destination. At Gate 47, Flight 219 to Washington, D.C. was getting ready to board. The passengers lined up, showing their tickets one by one. The flight attendant smiled politely. Everything looked normal. Then, a tall black man in his late 50s walked toward the gate. He was wearing a clean military jacket with medals on the chest and a cap that said U.S. Army Veteran. His back was straight and his face calm. He didn't smile much, but his eyes had a quiet strength. People looked at him as he passed. Some nodded with respect. Others ignored him, but one woman frowned. She was in her 40s, wearing an expensive white coat, big sunglasses, and holding a designer purse. Her name was Cheryl, but many would later call her something else. Karen. She stared at the man as he walked past her and whispered to herself, "What is he doing in first class?" She didn't say it loudly, but the man heard her. He didn't react. He just moved forward, scanning his boarding pass and entering the plane. Inside, the first-class cabin was peaceful. The seats were wide and soft. Some passengers were already sitting, sipping juice or reading magazines. The veteran took his seat, by the window. He placed his cap carefully on his lap. He looked out the window quietly. Soon, Cheryl entered the plane. As she walked down the aisle and saw the veteran again, her face twisted in disgust. "This must be a mistake," she said, loudly. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The veteran turned slowly. "Yes," he said calmly. "This is seat 2A. She looked shocked. But this is first class," she said. "I know," he said softly. She looked at the flight attendant. "Excuse me, there's a problem here. I think this man is in the wrong seat." The flight attendant checked the boarding passes. "No, ma'am," she said. "He's in the right seat." Cheryl's face turned red. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "I paid for comfort, not for this." The veteran said nothing. He just looked out the window again. The plane took off. The flight was smooth, but the tension wasn't. Cheryl sat stiffly beside him, clearly uncomfortable. She kept sighing loudly. Every time he moved, even slightly, she rolled her eyes. After 30 minutes, she spoke again. "You know," she said, loud enough for others to hear, "I just don't understand why people like you get special treatment." The veteran turned to her. "People like me?" he asked, still calm. "You know what I mean," she snapped. "I bet the airline gave you a free seat or something. Probably some charity thing." He looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were sharp but peaceful. "No," he said. "I paid for this seat." Cheryl laughed. "Sure you did." A few passengers turned their heads. They heard her words. A young woman in row 3 looked shocked. She quietly opened her phone and started recording. The veteran stayed quiet. He closed his eyes and leaned back. Cheryl, not getting a reaction, got louder. "You know what's wrong with this country? People like you getting more than they deserve, while people like me work hard every day." The flight attendant returned. "Ma'am," she said kindly but firmly, "I need to ask you to lower your voice." Cheryl snapped at her. "Why don't you ask him to lower his attitude?" "He hasn't said a word," the flight attendant replied. Cheryl crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." The plane flew on, but the cabin was no longer calm. People whispered to each other. Some looked angry. Some looked scared. No one spoke up, except one young man across the aisle. He leaned forward and said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, the man you're yelling at is a veteran. Maybe show a little respect." Cheryl glared at him. "Mind your own business." The veteran finally opened his eyes and said in a deep, quiet voice, "I didn't come here to fight. I came here to fly. Just like you." Cheryl scoffed. "Then maybe act like it." The young woman recording all this kept her phone low but steady. Her hands were shaking. She knew what she was capturing wasn't just rude. It was wrong. The flight attendant spoke to the captain through her radio. The situation was becoming serious. In the back of the plane, whispers spread like wildfire. Did you see what she said to him? She's out of control. That man hasn't even raised his voice. But Cheryl was still blind to the situation. She leaned over and said loudly, "You think wearing a uniform makes you special? You're just another—" "Ma'am!" the flight attendant interrupted sharply. "That's enough!" Cheryl sat back, shocked that someone finally stopped her. The veteran didn't move. His eyes looked out the window again, but inside, his heart was heavy. Not because of the insult. He had heard worse in the battlefield, but because the war never really ended. Not for him. The young woman stopped recording. Her hands were cold. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this video needed to be seen. The pilot's voice came on the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in about 1 hour. Please stay seated." But for many on that plane, something had already landed. The truth. The flight continued smoothly through the sky, but inside the plane, the air felt heavy. The silence was tense. Everyone had seen the woman's behavior. Some were angry. Some were afraid, and some just stayed quiet, pretending nothing had happened. Cheryl sat stiffly beside the veteran. Her lips were tight. Her arms were crossed. She glanced around the cabin as if expecting others to support her, but no one looked her in the eye. Sergeant David Lewis, the black veteran, sat calmly in his seat. He didn't speak. He didn't complain. He just stared at the clouds outside the window, his hands resting on his cap. Cheryl leaned toward him again. "You think sitting quietly makes you innocent?" she whispered harshly. "I know your type. You act like a victim, but you're just playing the race card." David didn't turn his head. His voice was low but clear. "Ma'am, I'm not playing anything. I just want peace." Cheryl laughed without humor. "Peace? Maybe try the back of the plane. That's where people like you usually sit." Her voice was louder now. Passengers nearby turned their heads. Some gasped. One older man shook his head in disgust. The same young woman from earlier, sitting 2 rows ahead, lifted her phone again. She began recording once more. A flight attendant rushed over. Her face was serious now. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again. Please stop speaking to this passenger. Your words are not acceptable." Cheryl rolled her eyes. "So now I can't speak? What, am I not allowed to express myself?" "You are allowed to speak," the attendant replied. "But not to insult or harass someone. That's against flight rules. And the law." Cheryl stood up in her seat. "Law? This man is making me uncomfortable. I don't feel safe sitting next to him." The cabin went completely quiet. David looked at her slowly, his eyes calm but tired. "I haven't moved. I haven't touched you. I haven't even raised my voice." Cheryl pointed at him. He looked at me in a threatening way. A passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged woman, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, you have been threatening him since the flight started." Another man behind her joined in. "We all saw it. You've been yelling and insulting him." Cheryl turned to them. "You people don't understand. He's dangerous. These people always are." A loud gasp filled the cabin. Everyone heard what she said. David slowly stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just stood tall, holding his cap in his hand. "I served in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "I've held my friends in my arms as they died. I've walked through bullets for this country, and today, this is how I'm treated." A woman began to cry in the back. The young woman recording whispered, "Oh my God." The flight attendant picked up the phone near the galley and called the captain. "Captain," she said, "we have a situation with a disruptive passenger, and we may need law enforcement when we land." Cheryl's eyes widened. "Wait, me? You're reporting me?" "You made a false threat against another passenger," the attendant said, "and we have multiple witnesses." Cheryl turned pale. She tried to sit back down. I didn't mean it like that. I just felt uncomfortable." "You made It about his race, the man across the aisle said coldly. We all heard you. David sat back down quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked forward, as if he had done this 100 times before. Because he had. Not on a plane, but in life. A little boy sitting near the front turned to his mother and asked, Mom, why are they being mean to the soldier? The mother whispered. Because some people don't understand respect. David heard it. And for the first time, during the whole flight, a small smile touched his lips. Cheryl was quiet now. Too quiet. She knew what was happening. People were still filming. The young woman who had recorded the beginning now had a full video, and she was already typing, This is happening on my flight. A racist woman harassing a black veteran. I'm shaking. Please, share this. She hit post. Within minutes, the video began spreading, even while the plane was still in the air. Back in her seat, Cheryl looked around, realizing no one was on her side. No one. She tried to speak again, but no one was listening anymore. Everyone's attention had shifted to the calm, quiet man in uniform, the man she had tried to humiliate. The plane moved forward through the clouds, but far below something had already started, a storm, and it wasn't in the sky. By the time Flight 219 landed in Washington, the air inside the cabin was thick with silence. Cheryl didn't speak again, not a single word. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. She kept glancing around, as if hoping someone, anyone, would defend. Her no one did. Sergeant David Lewis, the black veteran she had targeted, quietly gathered his things. He stood tall, nodded to the flight attendant who had stood up for him, and walked off the plane without looking back. But as he stepped into the terminal, the world outside was already beginning to change. The video was live, uploaded by the young woman from row 3. It had started spreading like wildfire, first on Twitter, then Facebook, then YouTube. In just 1 hour, it had already reached over 500,000 views. The title said, White Woman Harasses Black War Veteran on Flight. Watch his powerful silence. The clip showed everything, from Cheryl's first insulting comments to the moment. The flight attendant called the captain. It showed David's calmness, his strength, and his powerful words. I served in Afghanistan. I've walked through bullets for this country, and today, this is how I'm treated. That line hit people like a punch. Comments exploded. This man is a hero. She's disgusting. America, this is why we still have work to do. He didn't raise his voice once, and she still played the victim. Find this man. We want to thank him. People shared it over and over. Influencers reposted it. Veterans across the country commented with stories of how they had faced similar treatment. Within 6 hours, the video had over 5 million views. Hashtags started trending. Silent hero, veteran deserves respect, racism in first class, justice for David. Even news channels noticed. That night, a reporter on a major station said, This isn't just a viral video, this is America's mirror, and people are watching. But one person wasn't watching yet, Cheryl. She had gone home after the flight, thinking the worst was over. She had no idea her face was now on millions of screens. No idea people were calling for her to be arrested. No idea that reporters were already contacting the airline, or that her full name had been leaked online. She was sitting in her kitchen, sipping coffee, trying to forget the flight, when she got a call from her friend. Cheryl, it's all over the internet. You're everywhere. What are you talking about? Cheryl asked, confused. Her friend sounded scared. You better look for yourself. Cheryl opened her phone. Within seconds, she dropped her coffee cup. There she was, on video, on the news, on blogs. Her face, her words, her hate. The internet was tearing her apart. Hundreds of people had tagged her employer. Someone even posted her LinkedIn. Messages flooded her social media. You should be ashamed. He fought for your freedom, and this is how you repay him? I hope the FBI knocks on your door, she started shaking. No, no, no. Her phone rang again. This time it was her boss. Cheryl, I don't come in tomorrow. HR will be in touch. She fell to the floor. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside Cheryl's home, her world was crashing. The next morning, at 8:12 a.m., the doorbell rang. Cheryl was sitting on the couch, eyes red from crying. She hadn't slept. She opened the door slowly and froze. Two men in dark suits stood there. One flashed a badge, FBI, Miss Cheryl Thompson? She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. We need to speak with you about a flight you were on yesterday. Flight 219. She looked shocked. Wait, the FBI? Yes, ma'am. This isn't just a viral video anymore. Your statements could be considered a hate crime and a false report against a U.S. citizen. We take that seriously. I didn't mean it, she whispered. It was just words. One of the agents looked at her coldly. Words have consequences. They asked to come inside. Cheryl stepped back. Her hands were shaking. As they walked in, the camera on a neighbor's doorbell recorded the moment. That clip, too, would soon go viral. Karen gets visit from FBI after harassing black veteran mid-flight. The comments were brutal. She deserves it. Respect goes both ways. Karma came first class. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in a small apartment. He had turned off his phone. He didn't want fame. He didn't want attention. He just wanted peace. But the world had other plans. Someone knocked at his door. He opened it to find a young reporter holding a microphone. Sir, are you Sergeant David Lewis? David paused. Yes. You've gone viral. Millions are calling. You a hero? David looked tired. I didn't ask for that. But sir, she said, people want to hear your side. David looked down at the floor. Then he nodded slowly. Fine. I'll talk. But not for fame. For truth. Cheryl sat across the table in her own living room. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. Across from her sat two FBI agents, Agent Ward and Agent Collins. They looked calm but serious. They weren't here for tea. Agent Ward spoke first. Ms. Thompson, we received several reports after yesterday's flight. Many of them include video evidence. We're investigating possible civil rights violations and a false report you made mid-flight. Cheryl looked confused. False report? Agent Collins pulled out a file. You told the flight crew that Mr. David Lewis made you feel threatened. I did feel that way, Cheryl said quickly. He was looking at me with anger. I got scared. Agent Ward looked directly at her. Ma'am, in every video clip, Mr. Lewis remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten you. He didn't even move from his seat. Cheryl tried to speak but stopped. She had no answer. Collins continued. Let me be clear. Making a false statement about a person, especially one involving their race or background, is serious. And it's even more serious when it involves a decorated military veteran. I didn't know he was a veteran, Cheryl blurted out. Does that change the words you used? Ward asked quietly. Would you have acted differently if he were a white businessman? Cheryl looked down. I didn't mean it. I just got upset. I said things I shouldn't have. You didn't just say things, Agent Collins said. You tried to humiliate someone based on his appearance, and you made the crew believe he might be a threat. That's a federal issue on a commercial flight. Tears rolled down Cheryl's cheeks. So what happens now? That depends on what the airline decides, Ward said, and what federal prosecutors decide. But one thing's certain, your actions had consequences, not just online, but legally. The agents stood up. This interview is part of the official record, Agent Collins added. We advise you to seek legal counsel. They left quietly. Cheryl closed the door and leaned against it. Her heart pounded. The online hate was unbearable. But now, real consequences were following her offline too. Across town, Sergeant David Lewis sat in a quiet coffee shop with the young reporter who had knocked on his door. She placed her recorder on the table and said softly, "People are calling you a hero. Some want to start a GoFundMe. Others want to invite you to TV shows." David shook his head. "I didn't do anything heroic. I just stayed silent." "Your silence was powerful," the reporter said. "The whole country saw how you carried yourself. What do you want people to know?" David took a deep breath. "I've worn this uniform for 30 years. Not once have I asked for attention. Not once have I demanded respect. But sometimes, silence is not weakness. It's strength." The reporter nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Do you forgive her?" David paused. "I don't hate her," he said. "She's not the first. She won't be the last. But people like her remind me why I keep standing tall. Because I didn't serve for perfect people. I served so we could become better." The next day, that interview was posted online. And just like the video, it went viral. The comments poured in. "What a man. He's more than a veteran. He's a role model. Give this man a medal." TV shows invited him. Veterans groups reached out. Thousands of strangers messaged him, thanking him for his strength and dignity. But David didn't care about the fame. All he cared about was one thing, that people finally started listening. Meanwhile, Cheryl's life was falling apart. Her company had fired her. Her social media was gone. Even some of her friends stopped talking to her, and now her lawyer warned her, "The airline may file charges. The FBI may as well. If that happens, there could be jail time, or a very public court battle." Cheryl stared at the floor. "I just wanted to sit in peace, that's all." Her lawyer shook his head. "Then maybe you shouldn't have opened your mouth." The world had changed overnight. But not just for Cheryl. People on the internet had started real conversations. How often do we ignore racism when it's not loud? Why do we stay silent when someone's being mistreated? Would I have stood up like that flight attendant did? Across the country, teachers played the video in classrooms. Military officers shared it during training. Even airline staff used it in new anti-discrimination workshops. David didn't know it yet, but his calm had started a wave of awareness. Not because he shouted, but because he refused to sink to hate. David Lewis didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want the camera. He didn't want the attention. He had lived his life quietly, serving his country, protecting people, even those who looked down on him. But now, the world wanted to hear him speak. After the flight video and his calm interview went viral, TV channels, podcasts, and newspapers flooded his inbox. Celebrities reposted his words. Veterans across the world called him the man who kept his honor in the sky. But David wasn't smiling. He sat at his small kitchen table staring at a letter in his hands. It was from his old army buddy, Marcus. "Brother, I saw the video. I cried. We lost so many, and now you stand for us. Not with fists, but with dignity. You gave the world a lesson. Thank you." David folded the letter slowly. He looked around the room, quiet and empty. No cameras, no reporters, just silence. That's when he made a decision. He would speak, not for fame, but for all the soldiers who never got the chance to be heard. The next day, David agreed to a national interview. The set was simple: a chair, a camera, and a quiet stage. The host welcomed him respectfully. "Sergeant Lewis, millions saw what happened on that flight. Why did you stay silent?" David looked straight at the camera. "Because I've seen louder wars." The host leaned in. "What do you mean?" "I've heard bombs drop. I've held brothers in my arms. I've seen real hate, not words, but weapons. So when a woman looks down on me for the color of my skin, that doesn't break me. It reminds me why I wore this uniform in the first place." The room was quiet. David continued. "She thought she could shame me. But she only showed the world what hate really looks like in 2025. Soft on the outside, but sharp underneath. The host asked, "Do you think people will change?" David nodded slowly. "They already are, not because I fought back, but because people finally stopped looking away." The interview went viral again, this time even faster. Clips flooded TikTok, Instagram, and news sites. "Because I've seen louder wars. Hate is still here, just wearing a new face." You can't shake a man who's already walked through fire. Teachers printed his quotes on classroom walls. Students wrote essays about him. Even military academies began using the clip in their character in uniform programs. Meanwhile, Cheryl watched from her parents' house. She had lost her job, her apartment, her reputation. Her name had become a warning. At first, she was angry, then embarrassed, and now quiet. She sat in front of her laptop, watching David's interview. The way he spoke, the way he didn't blame her, even when the world was ready to. She pressed pause and whispered to herself, "I was wrong." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She opened a blank email to Sergeant David Lewis. Subject, an apology. But then, she froze. What could she even say? Back in the city, David received hundreds of emails every hour. Support, love, stories. But one email caught his eye. No subject, no name, just 3 lines. "I was the woman on that flight. I can't undo what I did, but I'm sorry." David stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't reply. Not yet. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the morning light. He had carried weapons. He had carried pain. Now, he carried a message, and the world was finally listening. The video of Sergeant David Lewis had reached every corner of the country. From big cities to small towns, people watched him speak with calm strength. His words, "I've seen louder wars," were now printed on signs, shirts, and banners. He had never planned to become a symbol, but the country had made him one. In a high school classroom in Ohio, a history teacher paused the lesson and played David's interview. The students watched silently. When it ended, the teacher asked, "What did you learn from him?" A girl in the back whispered, "That real strength is quiet." A boy added, "And hate looks smaller next to dignity." In a small diner in Texas, a group of veterans sat around their morning coffee. One of them, an old man with a limp, raised his mug and said, "To David, the man who fought 2 wars, one overseas, one in the air, and won both without firing a shot." They all raised their mugs in silence. In a church in Georgia, a pastor spoke on Sunday morning. He didn't curse her. He didn't hit back. He carried peace into a fight. And sometimes, that's louder than anger. The crowd nodded. Some wiped tears from their eyes. But not everyone was clapping. Online, a few voices tried to spin the story. "She was just having a bad day," some said. "Not everything is about race," others argued. But the country had already seen the truth. They saw the video, they saw Cheryl's words, and they saw David's response, the silent kind that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, Cheryl stayed inside her parents' home. News crews had stopped showing up, but the whispers hadn't. She couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring. Her inbox was filled with hate, and some unexpected messages, too. Some said, "I hope you learn from this." Others said, "Change is possible, but it starts with you." One night she watched the video again. For the 5th time, she stared at David's face. How he didn't flinch. How he didn't fight. How he let her words fall like rain on stone. And for the first time, she understood. It wasn't just about her bad behavior, it was about everything people like her never had to think about. At the same time, David was invited to speak at the White House. He stood at the podium, wearing his military jacket. Cameras flashed. People clapped, but he didn't smile. He spoke softly. "I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be a story, but if my silence can start a conversation, then I'll keep speaking. He looked into the camera and said, "To anyone who's ever felt invisible, you matter, you belong, and you don't have to shout to be heard." The room stood up in applause. Millions watched live, and in homes across the country, hearts shifted. In one of those homes, Cheryl sat watching. She wasn't clapping, but she was listening, and that was a start. Days passed. The world kept talking about Sergeant David Lewis. People called him a hero, a symbol, a reminder of the quiet strength that still existed in the world. But behind all the noise, one person sat in silence: Cheryl. She hadn't left her parents' home in over a week. She had turned off the TV, deleted her social media, and ignored calls from old friends. Those who still dared to call. The world had punished her. She had lost her job, her apartment, and her name. But the worst punishment wasn't outside. It was inside. She couldn't stop hearing her own voice on the plane. The words she used, the looks she gave, the way she pointed fingers at a man who never raised his voice. She had watched the video a dozen times, and now she didn't see a man sitting quietly. She saw herself, someone she didn't even recognize anymore. Her mother knocked gently on the bedroom door. "There's someone here to see you." Cheryl frowned. "Who?" Her mother shrugged. "He said he's from the veterans group." In the living room stood a tall man in a green jacket. He wasn't David, but he wore the same kind of calm. He held a sealed envelope. "I'm not here to attack you," he said kindly. "David wanted you to have this." Cheryl took the envelope with shaking hands. The man nodded once and left. Back in her room, she opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Ms. Thompson, I read your email. You didn't sign it, but I knew it was you. I've thought about what to say. I won't lie. I was hurt, not just by your words, but by how easily people believed you. But I've carried heavier pain in war. I've seen worse things than your anger. That's why I forgive you. Not because you asked, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry your hate with me. I hope you find peace." David Lewis. Tears spilled from Cheryl's eyes. For the first time since the flight, she sobbed. Not out of shame, but because someone she had tried to tear down had chosen to lift her instead. A week later, Cheryl asked a local church if she could speak. They were hesitant, but they agreed. She stood in front of a small crowd. Her voice shook as she spoke into the mic. "I was the woman on that plane." Gasps filled the room. "I judged a man because of his skin. I said awful things. I humiliated him, and I lied." The crowd went silent. "But he forgave me. A man I didn't even respect had the strength to do what I couldn't. He chose peace." She paused, her hands trembling. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise this. I will spend the rest of my life unlearning the hate that lived inside me." That video was recorded and shared online. To many, it was shocking, but to David, it was hope. He watched the video quietly, sitting in the same coffee shop. A younger man at the next table leaned over. "Sir, you changed her." David shook his head. "No," he said softly. "She changed herself." Across the country, the video of Cheryl's apology sparked new conversations. People can change. Hate is taught, but so is healing. What if we forgave more and judged less? For the first time in years, the internet wasn't tearing someone apart. It was watching someone rebuild. Months had passed since the flight. The world had moved on. But something had changed, not just in the headlines, in people. Airlines introduced new training for flight crews. They taught staff how to recognize discrimination, not ignore it. Schools held workshops. Churches held open talks. People didn't just repost David's story. They started asking themselves, what would I do? Sergeant David Lewis returned to his quiet life. He still walked the same streets, still drank coffee at the small shop, down the block. But strangers now nodded at him. Children waved, and veterans he had never met saluted him from across the street. He didn't need applause. What he saw in people's eyes, that silent respect, was enough. One evening, David stood at a park watching a group of young boys playing. A father nearby nudged his son. "You see that man?" he whispered. "He taught the country what honor looks like." The boy looked up, wide-eyed. "Did he fight in a war?" The boy asked. "Yes," the father said softly, "and then he fought another one without using his fists." At a local women's shelter, Cheryl volunteered twice a week. She didn't talk much about what happened on the plane. She didn't need to. But one day, a woman asked her gently, "Why do you help here?" Cheryl smiled sadly. "Because I was broken once, and someone gave me a second chance. I'm just trying to do the same." She never tried to clean her name online. She never defended her actions again. Instead, she let her actions speak, and slowly, quietly, people began to see the change. One morning, Cheryl received a letter. No name, just a card. Inside were 5 words. "I see you trying. Keep going." There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. She held the card to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." In his home, David sat by the window watching the sun rise. He wasn't waiting for anything. He had already received the most important reward, a country that chose to open its eyes, not because of rage, but because one man in one seat on one plane chose peace over pride.